On this day in history, July 1st, 552, the Battle of Taginae is fought, in which Byzantine forces under Narses defeat the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Ostrogoth king, Totila, is mortally wounded. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the battle. The Battle of Taginae was fought in July 552. It terminated the Gothic wars of the Emperor Justinian, and was won over the Gothic king, Badulia, by the eunuch Narses, a general who in ability rivaled the great Belisarius, his contemporary. Taginae is situated below the Apennines near modern Gubbio. Narses had crossed the head of the valley of the Chioschio when Badulia arrived and seized its main outlet. The Goth ranged the whole of his horsemen in front. His infantry, mostly archers, he drew up in a second line. His aim was to ride down the imperial army in one terrific charge. Belisarius had noted the weakness in the Gothic tactics, namely that there was no cooperation between lance and bow. Narses now aimed at this cooperation, but in a novel form which closely resembles the combined tactics made use of by Edward III at Crécy. He dismounted his cavalry, foederati, and formed a phalanx 8,000 strong, on the wings of which he drew up 8,000 archers with their outer ranks thrown forward. In the rear of these he posted his Roman cavalry to combine fire and shock. His left flank he rested on a small hill, which he occupied by a force of infantry, and at the foot of which he deployed a few squadrons of cavalry. At noon Badulia, ignoring the archers, suddenly charged his enemy's center, expecting to overwhelm it. For infantry he held in contempt. He was met by a tremendous converging fire of arrows which slew and dismounted hundreds of his knights. After several assaults he clinched with the imperial center, its protective base of action, which held him firm whilst his flanks were plied with arrows. At length, exhausted, the Gothic horsemen broke back, when immediately Narses launched his mounted squadrons, driving them in confusion onto their infantry, which were ridden over. The victory was complete. On this day in history, July 2nd, 437, Emperor Valentinian III begins his reign over the Western Roman Empire. His mother, Galla Placidia, ends her regency, but continues to exercise political influence at the court in Rome. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the emperor. Valentinian III, Emperor of the West from 425 to 455, the son of Constantius and Placidia. He was only 6 years of age when he ascended the throne, and during his minority the conduct of affairs was in the hands of his mother. His reign is marked by the dismemberment of the Western Empire, the conquest of the province of Africa by the Vandals in 439, the loss of great portions of Spain and Gaul, in which the barbarians had established themselves, and the ravaging of Sicily and of the western coasts of the Mediterranean by the fleets of Genseric. As a set-off against these calamities, there was a great victory of Aetius over Attila in 451 near Chalons, and his successful campaigns against the Visigoths in southern Gaul, 426, 429, 436, and against various invaders on the Rhine and Danube, 428 to 31. Ravenna was Valentinian's usual residence, but he fled to Rome on the approach of Attila, who ravaged North Italy in 452. In 454, Aetius was treacherously murdered by Valentinian. Next year, however, the emperor himself was assassinated by two of the barbarian followers of Aetius. He was self-indulgent, incompetent, and vindictive. On this day in history, July 3rd, 987, Hugh Capet is crowned King of France, the first of the Capetian dynasty that would rule France until the French Revolution in 1792. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the king. Hugh Capet, born circa 938, died 996, King of France and founder of the Capetian dynasty, was the eldest son of Hugh the Great by his wife Hadwig. When his father died in 956, he succeeded to his numerous fiefs around Paris and Orleans, and his cousin, the Frankish king Lothair, recognized him somewhat reluctantly as Duke of the Franks. Many of the counts of northern France did homage to him as their overlord, and Richard I, Duke of Normandy, was both his vassal and his brother-in-law. His authority extended over certain districts, both of the Loire, and, owing to his interference, Lothair was obliged to recognize his brother Henry as Duke of Burgundy. He supported his royal sovereign when Lothair and Emperor Otto II fought for the possession of Lorraine, but chagrined at the king's conduct in making peace in 980, he went to Rome to conclude an alliance with Otto. Laying more stress upon independence than upon loyalty, Hugh appears to have acted in a haughty manner toward Lothair and also towards his son and successor, Louis V, but neither king was strong enough to punish this powerful vassal. When Louis V died without children in May 987, Hugh and the late king's uncle Charles, Duke of Lower Lorraine, were candidates for the vacant throne, and in this contest the energy of Hugh's champions, Adalberon, Archbishop of Rheims, and Gerbert, afterwards Pope Sylvester II, prevailed, declaring that the Frankish crown was an elective and not a hereditary dignity. Adalberon secured the elections of his friend and crowned him, probably at Noyon, in July 987. The authority of the new king was quickly recognized in his kingdom, which covered the greater part of France north of the Loire, with the exception of Brittany, and in a shadowy fashion he was acknowledged in Aquitaine, but he was compelled to purchase the allegiance of the great nobles by large grants of royal lands, and he was hardly more powerful as king than he had been as duke. Moreover, Charles of Lorraine was not prepared to bow before his successful rival, and before Hugh had secured the coronation of his son Robert as his colleague and successor in December 987, he had found allies and attacked the king. Hugh was worsted during the earlier part of the struggle, and was in serious straits, until he was saved by the wiles of his partisan Adalberon, Bishop of Laon, known as Asselin, who in 991 treacherously seized Charles and handed him over to the king. The capture virtually ended the war, but one of its side issues was a quarrel between Hugh and Pope John XV, who was supported by the empire, then under the rule of the Empress Adelaide and Theophano, as regents for the young Emperor Otto III. In 987, the king had appointed to the vacant archbishoprics of Rheims a certain Arnulf, who at once proved himself a traitor to Hugh and a friend to Charles of Lorraine. In June 991, at the insistence of the king, the French bishops deposed Arnulf and elected Gerbert in his stead, a proceeding which was displeasing to the Pope, who excommunicated the new archbishop and his partisans. Hugh and his bishops remained firm, and the dispute was still in progress when the king died at Paris on October 24, 996. Hugh was a devoted son of the Church, to which, it is not too much to say, he owed his throne. As lay abbot of the abbeys of St. Martin at Tours and of St. Denis, he was interested in clerical reform, was fond of participating in religious ceremonies, and had many friends among the clergy. His wife was Adelaide, daughter of William III, Duke of Aquitaine, by whom he left a son, Robert, who succeeded him as King of France. The origin of Hugh's surname of Capet, which was applied to his father, has been the subject of some discussion. It is derived undoubtedly from the Latin capa, a cape, but whether Hugh received it from the cape which he wore as abbot of St. Martin's, or from his youthful and playful habit of seizing caps, or from some other cause, is uncertain. On this day in history, July 4th, 362 BC, the Battle of Mantinea is fought, in which the Thebans, led by Epaminondas, defeated the Spartans. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The second and more justly famous battle took place in 362, and is memorable not only for Epaminondas' further development of the epoch-making tactics which he had introduced at Leuctra, but also for his death in the moment of victory. He is immortalized by two battles. A year after Leuctra, Epaminondas had led the forces of the newly formed Arcadian League in a march on virgin Sparta itself. The march had been admirably carried out in 3 converging columns, over mountain routes in midwinter, and with deep strategical insight. Epaminondas had made an indirect approach to his goal, slipping past Sparta and then moving up from its rear. Strong reinforcements came to Sparta from her allies in the Peloponnesian League, and his own design was thwarted by the dwindling away of his own allies, whose troops preferred easy plunder to the chance of decisive victory. He was thus compelled to retire rather than pay exorbitantly for military success, but only after establishing the new Messenian state as a check on, and counterpoise to, Sparta in southern Greece. And with his subsequent foundation of Megalopolis as a further check, his grand strategy had attained the greater political object of definitely overthrowing Sparta's long supremacy in the Peloponnese. But with his subsequent, if temporary, succession, Theban democracy forfeited its advantages by short-sighted policy and blundering diplomacy, and enabled its Arcadian allies, repudiating gratitude in growing conceit and ambition, to dispute Theban leadership. Thus, in 362, Thebes was driven to choose between reasserting her authority and sacrificing her prestige. Her move against Arcadia caused Greece to divide afresh into two hostile coalitions. Once more, Epaminondas made a surprise spring at Sparta, but he was deprived of the fruits of his night march through a deserter warning the Spartan main army in time for it to hurry back and safeguard the capital. Epaminondas then stood on guard at Taginae, while the enemy forces concentrated at Mantinea. The valley in which these places lay is shaped like an hourglass by the surrounding mountain ranges, and at the mile-wide waste the Spartans and their allies took up a strong position. He determined to seek a decision by battle, but as in his strategy, so in his grand tactics showed the art by an indirect approach. At first, Epaminondas marched direct towards the Spartan camp, causing the enemy to form up in battle order facing his line of approach. But then, still several miles distant, he suddenly changed direction to the left, turning in beneath a projecting spur. This surprise maneuver threatened to take and enfilade the Spartan right, and to dislocate still further the Spartans' battle dispositions, he halted his troops and made them ground arms as if to encamp. The deception succeeded. The enemy were induced to relax their battle order, allowing men to fall out and their horses to be unbridled. Meanwhile, Epaminondas was actually completing his battle dispositions behind a screen of light troops. Then, on a signal, the Theban army took up its arms and swept forward. Caught by surprise, the enemy made haste to reform, but their cavalry were driven back by the Theban cavalry covering the left flank of the massed column, and this, striking the Spartan line like the prow of a galley, pierced it in two. But in the moment of decision, Epaminondas himself was mortally wounded, and with his fall the advance came to a stop and failed to complete the victory already won. On this day in history, July 5th, 1859, the United States discovers and claims Midway Atoll. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Midway Islands. Midway Islands, a circular atoll in the mid-Pacific Ocean, latitude 28 degrees, 13 minutes north, longitude 177 degrees, 23 minutes west, about 6 miles in diameter, enclosing two islands, Eastern and Sand Islands. Population from 1940, 437. It was a deserted sands pit until 1903, when U.S. Marines landed and a station of the Trans-Pacific Cable was built. Until then, the few visitors to Midway had consisted of Japanese fishermen, who went there for the purpose of killing the numerous seabirds for their feathers. The islands were discovered by Captain Brooks of the Gambia in 1859. Another ship, the Wandering Minstrel, was wrecked there in 1887, and Captain Walker, his wife, and the members of the crew subsisted for 14 months on fish and birds' eggs before they were rescued. The cable station was one link between Midway and the outside world. Another was established in 1936 when Pan American Airways established its Clipper service to the Philippines, using Midway, Wake, and Guam as stopping points between Hawaii and the Philippines. An inn was built for passengers on the Clippers, located about 1,300 miles west of Hawaii. Midway was regarded as an important naval outpost, especially as tension in the Pacific area increased. A garrison of Marines was stationed at Midway, and a number of laborers were imported from the United States to build ground, naval, and air defenses. One of the natural defenses of Midway is the narrow encircling reef, about 5 feet high, which represents a danger to navigation. Japanese naval forces attacked Midway during the first days of the war in the Pacific in December 1941, along with Wake and Guam. But Midway held out and remained in U.S. hands. On this day in history, July 6th, 371 BC, the Battle of Leuctra shatters Sparta's reputation of military invincibility. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Leuctra, 371 BC. Leuctra, a village of Boeotia in the territory of Thespe, is chiefly noticeable in the annals of general history for the battle fought in its neighborhood in 371 BC between the Thebans and the Spartans and their allies. But in military history, it is far more than noticeable. In fact, epoch-making. For here the oblique order was born, which came to maturity under Alexander the Great, and was resurrected in modern times with equally startling success by Frederick the Great. And apart from its originality, at Leuctra, Epaminondas's maneuver was in some ways more unconventional in its execution than those of his more famous successors. This is more remarkable when we judge him by the criterion of his time, and remember that he was flagrantly breaking with the tradition of centuries of warfare. A Peloponnesian army, about 10,000 strong, which had invaded Boeotia from Phaeocis, was confronted by a Boeotian levy of perhaps 6,000 soldiers under Epaminondas. In spite of its inferior numbers and the doubtful loyalty of his Boeotian allies, Epaminondas offered battle on the plain before the village. The Peloponnesian army formed up in the traditional manner, with the Spartans on the right under their king, Cleombrotus, who was in command of the whole. Instead of following suit and placing his best on the right, Epaminondas not merely reversed this procedure, but massed a 50-deep column of Theban infantry on its left wing, with the famous sacred band at its head and cavalry protecting its flank. He sent forward this body in advance of his center and right wing, thus by refusing the latter, saving it from the otherwise inevitable overlapping which would have occurred on contact with the enemy. After a cavalry engagement in which the Thebans drove their opponents off the field, the decisive issue was fought out between the Theban and Spartan foot. The latter, though fighting well, could not sustain in their 12-deep formation the cumulative impact of their opponent's column, and were hurled back with a loss of about 2,000 men, of whom 700 were Spartan citizens, including the king Cleombrotus. Seeing their right wing beaten, the rest of the Peloponnesians retired and left the enemy in possession of the field. Owing to the arrival of the Thessalian army under Jason of Pherae, whose friendship they did not trust, the Thebans were unable to exploit their victory, but the battle is nonetheless of great significance in Greek history. Its political effects were far-reaching, for the loss in material strength and prestige which the Spartans here sustained deprived them forever of their supremacy in Greece, but by its influence on tactics it was still more far-reaching, for it was to affect vitally the outcome of the struggle between Greece and Persia, and both indirectly and directly the destiny of modern Europe. It is the first known instance of a deliberate concentration of strength against a vital point of the enemy's formation as a means, first, to offset an inferiority on the whole front by a local superiority at the decisive point, and, secondly, to obtain a decision by dislocating instead of merely wearing down the enemy's body. This is the true art of war, and it is especially significant that Epaminondas directed his concentration against the enemy's command, the moral objective, because the seat of his will to victory. On this day in history, July 7th, 1798, as a result of the XYZ affair, the U.S. Congress rescinds the Treaty of Alliance with France, sparking the Quasi-War. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the XYZ affair. XYZ Correspondence. The letters, which, when made public in 1798, nearly involved France and the United States in a war. By the orders of the French Directory, fully 1,000 U.S. vessels had been stopped on the high seas for examination. President Adams sent 3 commissioners, C. Pinckney, Marshall, and Gary, to France to negotiate a treaty which would do away with this annoyance. The commissioners were met in France by 3 agents who demanded a large sum of money before the Directory would receive the commission, and also notified the commission that France would expect a loan from the United States if satisfaction of any other kind was to be given. The commissioners, upon rejecting these overtures, were ordered out of France. Their report was published at once in the United States, and in it the French agents were labeled X, Y, and Z, from which the correspondence took its name. The United States increased its army and navy, and hostilities were actually begun, when Talleyrand disavowed any connection with the agents and agreed to receive any minister the United States might send. On this day in history, July 8th, 1709, Peter I of Russia defeats Charles XII of Sweden at the Battle of Poltava, thus effectively ending Sweden's status as a major power in Europe. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Poltava, a town in the Ukrainian SSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, on the right bank of the Vorskla River, in 49 degrees 36 minutes north, 34 degrees 35 minutes east. Population from 1939, 130,305. It is the center of an agricultural district in which grain, sugar beet, tobacco, vines, and orchard fruits are grown. Leather is the chief manufacture, and there is an annual fair for the sale of skins, leather, and leather goods. Other industries include smelting, stocking manufacture, distilling, and brewing. The town is on the railway and is a grain collecting center. The Russian annals mention Poltava in 1174 under the name of Letava. In 1430, it was given, together with Glinsk, to the Tatar prince Leuctra by Gedmin, prince of Lithuania. Under the Cossack chief Bogdan Chmielnicki, it was the chief town of the Poltava regiment. Peter the Great defeated Charles XII of Sweden in the neighborhood of Poltava in 1709. On this day in history, July 9th, 1701, a Bourbon force under Nicholas Catinat withdraws from a smaller Habsburg force under Prince Eugene of Savoy in the Battle of Carpi. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Carpi, a town and episcopal see of Emilia, Italy, in the province of Medina, 9 miles north by northwest by rail from the town of Medina. Population from 1936 in the town, 13,805. In the commune, 34,189. It is in the center of a fertile agricultural district. Carpi contains several Renaissance buildings of interest: the facade of the old cathedral, an early Romanesque building, the new cathedral, after 1513, the nave of St. Niccolò, and a palace, all by Baldassare Poruzzi, while the Prince's Palace, with a chapel containing frescoes by Bernardino Loschi of Parma, 1489 to 1540, and the colonnades opposite the theater are good. These, and the fortifications, are all due to Alberto Pio of Carpi, a pupil of Aldus Manutius. On this day in history, July 10th, 1290, Ladislao IV, King of Hungary, is assassinated at the castle of Koroseg, modern-day Cersig, in Romania. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Ladislao IV, the Cumanian, born 1262, died 1290. King of Hungary, succeeded his father Stephen V in 1272. His minority, from 1272 to 77, was an alternation of palace revolutions and civil wars, in the course of which his Cuman mother, Elizabeth, was engaged in a continuous struggle with rebellious vassals supported by Ottokar of Bohemia. Rudolf of Habsburg, however, on becoming emperor, sought Ladislaus' help, and the young king at the Battle of Dernkraut, August 12, 1278, destroyed the Bohemian power. This danger removed, Ladislao, a talented man, but wild and reckless, was at once involved in a further struggle with his own magnates. He had married, for political reasons, Elizabeth of Anjou, but neglected her for Cuman mistresses, and was accused by his enemies of undermining Christianity by preferring the Cumans to the Magyars. After an inquiry by a papal legate into his conduct, he was forced to take up arms against the Cumans, whom he defeated at Hodmezo, May 1282, but soon relapsed, adopted Cuman dress, passed his time exclusively with Cumans, and ill-treated his legitimate wife. At last the Pope, Nicholas IV, decided to supersede him by his Angevin kinsfolk, and on August 8, 1288, proclaimed a crusade against him. For the first 2 years, all Hungary was convulsed by a horrible civil war. Ladislao, who fought to the last with desperate valor, was driven from one end of the kingdom to the other, like a hunted beast. On December 25, 1289, he issued a manifesto to the lesser gentry, many of whom sided with him, urging them to continue the struggle against the magnates and their foreign supporters. But on July 10, 1290, he was murdered in his camp at Koroseg by the Cumans, who never forgave him for deserting them in 1282. On this day in history, July 11th, 813, Byzantine Emperor Michael I, under threat by conspiracies, abdicates in favor of his general, Leo the Armenian, and becomes a monk under the name Athanasius. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Leo. Leo V, surnamed the Armenian, Emperor of the East from 813 to 820, was a distinguished general under Nicephorus I and Michael I. After rendering good service on behalf of the latter in a war with the Arabs, 812, he was summoned in 813 to cooperate in a campaign against the Bulgarians. Taking advantage of the disaffection prevalent among the troops, he left Michael in the lurch at the Battle of Versinikia, and subsequently led a successful revolution against him. Leo justified his usurpation by repeatedly defeating the Bulgarians who had been contemplating the siege of Constantinople, 814 to 817, by his vigorous measures of repression against the Paulicians and image worshippers. He roused considerable opposition, and after a conspiracy under his friend Michael Celsus had been foiled by the imprisonment of its leader, he was assassinated in the palace chapel on Christmas Eve, 820, by his partisans.
On this day in history, July 12, 1543, King Henry VIII of England marries his sixth and last wife, Catherine Parr, at Hampton Court Palace. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia, going over the history of the Queen. Catherine Parr, 1512 to 1548, the sixth Queen of Henry VIII, was a daughter of Sir Thomas Parr, died 1517, of Kendal, an official of the royal household. When only a girl, she was married to Edward Burrough, and after his death, in or before 1529, to John Neville, Lord Latimer, who died in 1542 or 1543. Latimer had only been dead a few months when, on the 12th of July, 1543, Catherine was married to Henry VIII at Hampton Court. The new queen, who was regent of England during the king's absence in 1544, acted in a very kindly fashion towards her stepchildren, but her patience with the king did not prevent a charge of heresy from being brought against her. Henry, however, would not permit her arrest, and she became a widow for the third time on his death in January 1547. In the same year she married a former lover, Sir Thomas Seymour, now Lord Seymour of Sudley. Soon after this event, on the 7th of September 1548, she died at Sudley Castle. Catherine was a pious and charitable woman, and a friend of learning. She wrote The Lamentation or Complaint of a Sinner, which was published after her death.
On this day in history, July 13th, 1249, the coronation of Alexander III as King of the Scots. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Alexander III, born 1241, died 1285, King of Scotland, son of Alexander II by his second wife, Mary de Cossey, succeeded the throne in 1240, at the age of 8. The years of his minority were marked by an embittered struggle for the control of affairs between two rival parties, the one led by Walter Cummin, Earl of Menteith, the other by Alan Durward, the Justiciar. At the marriage of Alexander to Margaret of England in 1251, Henry III seized the opportunity to demand from his son-in-law homage for the Scottish kingdom, but the claim was refused. On attaining his majority, Alexander laid formal claim before the Norwegian king Haakon for the sovereignty over the Hebrides, where Scandinavians had settled since the 9th century. Haakon replied by a formidable expedition in 1263. Sailing around the west coast of Scotland, he halted off Arran, where negotiations were opened. These were prolonged by Alexander until the autumn storms should begin. At length, Haakon attacked only to encounter a terrific storm, which greatly damaged his ships. The Battle of Largs, October 12, 1263, was indecisive, but even so, Haakon's position was hopeless. Baffled, he turned homewards, but died on the way. In 1266, Haakon's successor concluded a treaty by which the Isle of Man and the Western Isles were ceded to Scotland in return for a sum of 4,000 marks in 4 yearly payments, Orkney and Shetland alone being retained for Norway. The marriage of Alexander's daughter, Margaret, to Eric, son of King Magnus, was also agreed. Towards the end of Alexander's reign, the death of all his 3 children, within a few years, made the question of the succession one of pressing importance. In 1284, he induced the estates to recognize as his heir presumptive his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, and next year the desire for a male heir led him to contract a second marriage. Alexander was killed by a fall from his horse in the dark while riding to visit the Queen at Kinghorn on March 16, 1285. The Lament for Alisander, cited by Whiten, written in praise of Alexander III, is one of the earliest Scottish poems extant. On this day in history, July 14th, 1223, Louis VIII becomes King of France upon the death of his father, Philip II. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Louis VIII, Born 1187, died 1226, eldest son of Philip Augustus and of Isabella Hainaut, was born in Paris on September 5, 1187. Louis left the reputation of a saint, but was also a warrior prince. In 1213 he led the campaign against Ferrand, Count of Flanders. In 1214, while Philip Augustus was winning the victories of Bourvin, he held John of England in check, and was victorious at La Roche-aux-Moines. In the autumn of 1215, Louis received from a group of English barons, headed by Geoffrey de Mandeville, a request to pluck them out of the hand of this tyrant, John. Louis himself prepared to invade England. The expedition was forbidden by the papal legate, but Louis landed at Stonar on May 22, 1216. The pretexts on which he claimed the English crown were set down in a memorandum drawn up by French lawyers in 1215. These claims, that John had forfeited the crown by the murder of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, and that the English barons had the right to depose of the vacant throne, lost their plausibility on the death of King John and the ascension of his infant son as Henry III. In October 1216, the papal legate, Gualo, arrived in England at the same time as Louis. He excommunicated the French troops and the English rebels, and, after the Fair of Lincoln, in which his army was defeated, Louis resigned his pretensions, though by a secret article of the Treaty of Lambeth, September 1217, he secured a small war indemnity. Louis had assisted Simon de Montfort in his war against the Albigenses in 1215, and after his return to France he again joined the crusade. With Simon's son and successor, Amaury de Montfort, he directed the brutal massacre which followed the capture of Marmande. Philip Augustus dying on July 14, 1223, Louis VIII was anointed at Rheims on August 6th. He continued his father's policy. His reign was taken up by two great designs: to destroy the power of the Plantagenets and to conquer the heretical south of France. An expedition conquered Poitou and Saintonge, 1224. In 1226 he led the crusade against the Albigenses in the south, forced Avignon to capitulate, and received the submission of Languedoc. While passing the Auvergne on his return to Paris, he died at Montpensier on November 8, 1226. His reign, short as it was, brought gains both to the royal domains and to the power of the crown over the feudal lords. He had married in 1200 Blanche of Castile, daughter of Alfonso IX of Castile, and granddaughter of Henry II of England, who bore him 12 children. His eldest surviving son was his successor, Louis IX. On this day in history, July 15th, 1381, John Ball, a leader in the Peasants' Revolt, is hanged, drawn, and quartered in the presence of King Richard II of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the priest. John Ball died 1381, an English priest who took a prominent part in the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Little is known of his early years, but he lived probably at York and afterwards at Colchester. He gained considerable fame as a preacher by expounding the doctrines of John Wycliffe, but especially by his insistence on the principle of social equality. These utterances brought him into collision with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and on 3 occasions he was committed to prison. He appears also to have been excommunicated, and in 1366 all persons were forbidden to hear him preach. His opinions, however, were not moderated, nor his popularity diminished by these measures, and his words had a considerable effect in stirring up the rising which broke out in June 1381. Ball was then in prison at Maidstone, but he was quickly released by the Kentish rebels, to whom he preached at Blackheath from the text, "When Adam delved in Eve's spawn, who was then the gentleman?" He urged his hearers to attack the principal lords of the kingdom and the lawyers, and he was afterwards among those who rushed into the Tower of London to seize Simon of Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury. When the rebels dispersed, Ball fled to the Midland counties, but was taken prisoner at Coventry and executed in the presence of Richard II on July 15, 1381. Ball, who was called by Froissart the mad priest of Kent, seems to have possessed the gift of rhyme. He undoubtedly voiced the feelings of the lower orders of society at that time. On this day in history, July 16, 1779, as part of the American Revolutionary War, light infantry of the Continental Army seize a fortified British Army position in a midnight bayonet attack at the Battle of Stony Point. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Stony Point, a township in Rockland County, New York, USA, population from 1940, 4,898. Its area is about 30 square miles. It was named from a rocky promontory which juts into the Hudson. During the Revolutionary War, it was of considerable strategic importance. The Americans occupied it in November 1776, and about 2 years later erected a blockhouse upon it. The garrison, however, was very small, and on May 31, 1779, it was taken by the British, who immediately erected much stronger fortifications. On the night of July 15th and 16th, it was recovered by General Anthony Wayne, in command of about 1,350 picked American troops, the garrison, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson, losing 63 in killed, 70 in wounded, and 543 taken prisoner. The American loss was only 15 killed and 83 wounded. The Americans, however, had no thought from the first of holding the place and evacuated it on July 18th, whereupon it was reoccupied by the British. But late in October, they too abandoned it. In the old Treason House in the township, General Benedict Arnold and Major John Andre met before daylight on September 22, 1780, to settle upon plans for the surrender of West Point by Arnold to the British.
On this day in history, July 17th, 1048, Damasus II is elected Pope, and dies 23 days later. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Pope. Damasus II, Pope from July 17th to August 9th, 1048, was the ephemeral successor of Clement II. His original name was Popo, and was the Bishop of Brixen, when the Emperor Henry III raised him to the papacy. On this day in history, July 18th, 387 BC, as part of the Roman-Gaulish Wars, the Battle of the Allia occurs, where a Roman army is defeated by raiding Gauls, leading to the subsequent sacking of Rome. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Allia. Allia, a small tributary of the Tiber on the left east bank, about 11 miles north of Rome. It gave its name to the terrible defeat of the Romans by the Gauls on July 18, 390 BC. Despite objections, Livy's account, placing the battle on the left bank of the Tiber, must probably be accepted. On this day in history, July 19th, 939, the Battle of Simancas is fought. King Ramiro II of Leon defeats the Moorish army under Caliph Abdu al-Rahman III, near the city of Simancas. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Simancas, a town of Spain, in the province of Valladolid, 8 miles southwest of Valladolid, on the road to Zamora, and the right bank of the river Pisuerga. Population from 1930, 1,195. Simancas is a town of great antiquity. The Romans Septimanica, with a citadel dating from the Moorish occupation in the 9th century. In 934, it was the scene of a battle between the Moors and Christians. The citadel is now the Archivo General de Rino, to which the National Archives of Spain were removed by order of Philip II in 1563. The transference thither was suggested to Charles V by Cardinal Jimenez or Cisneros, died 1517. The extensive alterations were made by 3 celebrated 16th century architects, Juan de Herrera, Alonso Bruguete, and Juan Gomez de Mora. The arrangement of the papers was entrusted to Diego de Ayala. They include important private as well as state papers. The archives of the Indies were transferred in 1784 to the Lona of Seville. On this day in history, July 20th, 911, Rollo lays siege to Chartres. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Chartres, a city of northwestern France and capital of the department of Eure-et-Loir, 55 miles southwest of Paris on the railway to Le Mans. Population, 1936, 26,747. Chartres is on the left bank of the Eure, on a hill crowned by its infamous cathedral, the spires of which are a landmark on the plain of Beauce, the granary of France. The Eure, which divides into 3 branches, is crossed by several bridges, some ancient, and is fringed remains of fortifications, notably the Porte Guillaume, 14th century, flanked by towers. The steep, narrow streets of the old town contrast with the boulevards which encircle it and divide it from the suburbs. The Cathedral of Notre Dame,
was founded by Bishop Fulbert, 11th century, on the site of a church which had been destroyed by fire. In 1194, another fire made new building necessary, and the present church was finished by 1240. There have been minor additions and alterations since that time. A fire in 1836 destroyed the upper woodwork. The statuary of the portals, the stained glass of the 13th century, and the choir screen of the Renaissance are all unique. The south spire, the Clocher Vieux, 351 feet high, dates from the 12th century. The Clocher Neuf, 377 feet, was not completed till the 16th century. The cathedral is 440 feet long, its choir measures 150 feet across, and the vaulting is 121 feet high. The Abbey Church of St. Pierre, chiefly 13th century, contains fine stained glass and 12 representations of the Apostles in enamel, 1547, by Leonard Limousin. St. Martin-Avoux is a 12th century church. The Hôtel de Ville, 17th century, contains a museum and library. An older Hôtel de Ville is of the 13th century, and there are medieval and Renaissance houses. Chartres was one of the principal towns of the Carnutes, and by the Romans was called Autricum, from the river Autura, and afterwards Civitas Carnatum. It was burnt by the Normans in 858 and unsuccessfully besieged by them in 911. It was in English hands from 1417 to 32. It was attacked unsuccessfully by the Protestants in 1568 and was taken in 1591 by Henry IV, who was crowned there 3 years afterwards. It was seized by the Germans on October 21, 1870, and used as a center of operations. During the Middle Ages, it gave its name to a countship held by the Counts of Blois and Champagne, and afterwards by the House of Chatillon, a member of which in 1286 sold it to the crown. It was raised to the rank of a duchy in 1528 by Francis I. The town is the seat of a bishop, a prefecture, a court of assizes, and has tribunals of first instance and of commerce, and a chamber of commerce. It is a market town for boues. Game pies of Chartres are well known. Industries include flour milling, timber sawing, brewing, distilling, iron founding, leather manufacture, dyeing, stained glass, hosiery, machinery, etc. On this day in history, July 21st, 230, Pope Pontinian succeeds Urban I as the 18th pope. After being exiled to Sardinia, he became the first pope to resign his office. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the pope. Pontinius, pope from 230 to 235. He was exiled by Emperor Maximinius to Sardinia, and in consequence of this sentence resigned, September 28, 235. He was succeeded by Anteros. On this day in history, July 2nd, 1209, the Massacre of Béziers occurs, the first major military action of the Albigensian Crusade. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Béziers, town of France, capital of an arrondissement, department of Hérault, 47 miles southwest of Montpellier by rail. Population from 1936, 69,880. Béziers lies in a wine-growing district, on a hill on the left bank of the Orbe, joined at this point by the Canal du Midi. The Romans established a colony here. The name Bessara occurs as early as Festus Avenius, later 4th century. The town was destroyed with a great massacre in 1209 by de Montfort in the crusade against the Albigenses. The walls were rebuilt in 1289, but the town suffered severely in the wars of the 16th century, and all its fortifications were destroyed in 1632. The Allée Paul Riquet divides the old town on the west from the new town on the east. Above the old ramparts towers St. Nazarene, the former cathedral, 12th to 14th centuries, a good specimen of the ecclesiastical fortification common in southern France. It has a rose window in the western facade and stained glass and iron grills in the choir windows, 14th century. Adjoining the south transept, there are Gothic cloisters of the 14th century. There are also remains of a Roman arena, road, canal, and railway across the Orbe at Béziers. It is a market for wine, brandy, manure, chemical products, grain, and flour. Béziers is the seat of a sub-prefect and has tribunals of first instance and of commerce, and several learned societies. On this day in history, July 23rd, 1862, as part of the American Civil War, Henry Halleck becomes General-in-Chief of the Union Army. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the general. Henry Wager Halleck, born 1815, died 1872, American general and jurist, was born at Westernville, Oneida County, New York, in 1815. Upon graduating from West Point Military Academy in 1839, he was appointed to the Engineers, and in 1845 he was sent by the government to visit the principal military establishments of Europe. After his return, Halleck delivered a course of lectures on the science of war, published in 1846 under the title Elements of Military Art and Science, a later edition of which was widely used as a textbook by volunteer officers during the Civil War. On the outbreak of the Mexican War in 1846, he served with the expedition to California and the Pacific Coast, acting for several years in California as a staff officer, and as Secretary of State under the military government, and in 1849 he helped to frame the state constitution of California. In 1854, Captain Halleck resigned his commission and took up the practice of law with great success. On the outbreak of the Civil War, he returned to the Army as a Major General, and in November 1861 he was charged with the supreme command in the Western Theater of War. There can be no doubt that his administrative skill was mainly instrumental in bringing order out of chaos in the hurried formation of large volunteer armies in 1861. But the strategical and tactical successes of the following spring were due rather to the skill and activity of his subordinate generals, Grant, Buell, and Pope, than to the plans of the Supreme Commander. In July, however, he was called to Washington as General-in-Chief of the armies. At headquarters, his administrative powers were conspicuous, but he proved to be utterly wanting in any large grasp of the military problem. The successive reverses of McClellan, Pope, Burnside, and Hooker in Virginia were not infrequently traceable to defects of the General-in-Chief. In March 1864, Grant was appointed to replace him, Halleck becoming Chief of Staff at Washington. This post he occupied with credit until the end of the war. Halleck's position as a soldier is easily defined by his uniform success as an administrative official, his equally uniform want of success as an officer at the head of the large armies in the field, and the popularity of his theoretical writings on war. While his interference with the dispositions of the commanders in the field was often disastrous, his services in organizing and instructing Union forces were of high value. He died at Louisville, Kentucky, January 9th, 1872. On this day in history, July 24th, 1701, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac founds the trading post at Fort Pontchartrain, which later becomes the city of Detroit. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Detroit, Michigan, USA, fronting 12 miles on the Detroit River and 4 miles on the River Rouge, is the oldest city of any size in the USA, west of the original seaboard colonies. Founded in 1701 by Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac with 100 settlers and soldiers, it was 17 years old when de Bienville began operations in New Orleans, and 63 years old before St. Louis was founded. The city antedates Buffalo by about a century, and it was 137 years old when Chicago received its first charter. The first settlers, as well as the first soldiers, were French, and the government was French until 1760, when, as one of the results of the French and Indian War, it was occupied by the British under Colonel Robert Rogers. A few English settlers took up farms nearby, but the place remained chiefly a military and trading post through the whole of the first century. During the Revolutionary War, Detroit was a center of British influence, and a point which Indian forays into the Ohio country were directed. Under the treaty that closed the war, Detroit passed nominally to the United Colonies, but on various pretexts the British held possession until January 11, 1796, when under the Jay Treaty, the American flag was raised over the fort. During the War of 1812, the place was surrendered to the British under General Brock, but the next year, after the Battle of Lake Erie, it was returned to United States control. In the year 1805, Michigan was organized as a separate territory, with Detroit as its capital and also as the county seat of Wayne County, which included what are now Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. The territory was afterwards narrowed down, and Detroit continued to be the capital of the territory until 1837. It was the capital of the state until 1847, when the seat of government changed to Lansing. In 1805, every house in the town except one was destroyed by fire. This gave opportunity for an entire replanning of the place. The old division into narrow streets and small lots was entirely abandoned. To each citizen whose old site was obliterated, a much larger lot was awarded free. The arrangement of streets left a number of open spaces which were dedicated as parks. The whole effect was one of openness and roominess unusual in the planning of towns at that early day. The older portions of the city retained the old characteristics of wide streets with occasional triangular parks. From this center radiate the main thoroughfares, which follow the lines of the old territorial roads. Michigan Avenue is the starting point of the old Chicago Road. Grand River Avenue runs across the state to the rapids of the Grand River, now the city of Grand Rapids. Woodward Avenue leads north to the Saginaws, and Gradion to the foot of Lake Huron. Outside the city limits, these roads were generally 4 rod wide, but modern improvement has transformed them mostly into wide paved roads. Woodward Avenue is 120 feet wide within the city limits and 204 feet wide from the city limits to Pontiac, making it one of the finest main roads in the country. When the automobile began to create a need for improved highways, the county of Wayne, of whose wealth and population Detroit constitutes the largest part, established an efficient road commission. Through its work, the county has been covered with an extensive network of paved roads. For a number of the main thoroughfares, 204 feet has been established as a standard width. The road system has been supplemented by ample provision for parks. The largest of these, River Rouge Park, is 1,204 acres, but Belle Isle Park is the gem of the system. It is an island of 985 acres in the Detroit River, connected with the mainland by a bridge. Palmer Park, 287 acres, Chandler, 230 acres, and Eliza Howe, 158 acres, are also highly developed. The total park system in 1940 comprised 3,651 acres. A boulevard 12 miles long and 150 feet wide encircles the central section of the city. The city's remarkable growth is shown by the increase in population, which in 1890 was 250,876, in 1900, 285,704, 1910, 465,766, 1920, 993,678, in 1930, 1,568,662, and in 1940, by federal census, 1,623,452. On this day in history, July 25th, 1137, Eleanor of Aquitaine marries Prince Louis, later King Louis VII of France, at the Cathedral of Saint André in Bordeaux. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Queen. Eleanor of Aquitaine, circa 1122, died 1204, wife of the English King Henry II, was the daughter and heiress of Duke William X of Aquitaine, whom she succeeded in April 1137. She married Prince Louis, the heir to the French crown, and a month later her husband became King of France under the title of Louis VII. Eleanor bore Louis 2 daughters but no sons. Their marriage was annulled by mutual contest in 1151. She then married Henry of Anjou. Louis, who had hoped that Aquitaine would descend to his daughters, was mortified and alarmed by the Angevin marriage, all the more so when Henry of Anjou succeeded to the English crown in 1154. From this event dates the beginning of the secular strife between England and France, which runs like a red thread through medieval history. Eleanor bore to her second husband 5 sons and 3 daughters. John, the youngest of their children, was born in 1167, but her relations with Henry passed gradually through indifference to hatred. Henry was an unfaithful husband, and Eleanor supported her sons in their Great Rebellion of 1173. Throughout the latter years of the reign, she was kept in a sort of honorable confinement. It was during her captivity that Henry formed his connection with Rosamund Clifford, the fair Rosamund of romance. Eleanor, therefore, can hardly have been responsible for the death of this rival, and the romance of the poisoned bowl appears to be an invention of the next century. Under the rule of Richard and John, the Queen became a political personage of the highest importance. To both her sons, the popularity which she enjoyed in Aquitaine was most valuable. She helped to frustrate the conspiracy with France which John concocted during Richard's captivity. She afterwards reconciled the king and the prince, thus saving for John the succession which he had forfeited by his misconduct. In 1199 she crushed an Angevin rising in favor of John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany. In 1201 she negotiated a marriage between her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, and Louis of France, the grandson of her first husband. It was through her staunch defense of Marabout in Poltava that John got possession of his nephew's person. She died on April 1, 1204, and was buried at Fontevraud. Although a woman of strong passions and great abilities, she is, historically, less important as an individual than as the heiress of Aquitaine, a part of which was, through her second marriage, united to England for some 400 years. On this day in history, July 26, 1309, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VII is recognized King of the Romans by Pope Clement V. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Henry VII, born circa 1269, died 1313. Roman Emperor, son of Henry III, Count of Luxembourg, passed his early days under French influences. In 1288 he succeeded his father, and 4 years later married Margaret, died 1311, daughter of John I, Duke of Brabant. After the death of the German king, Albert I, he was elected to the vacant throne on November 27, 1308. The Rhenish archbishops were pacified by the restoration of the Rhine tolls. Negotiations were begun with Philip IV, King of France, and with Robert, King of Naples, and the Habsburgs were confirmed in their possessions. At this time, Bohemia was ruled by Henry V, Duke of Carinthia, but the prevailing disorder induced some of the Bohemians to offer the crown, together with the hand of Elizabeth, daughter of the late King Wenceslaus II, to John, son of the German king. Henry accepted the offer, and in August 1310, John was invested with Bohemia, and his marriage was celebrated. Meanwhile, Henry had crossed the Alps, with the hope of reuniting Germany and Italy, and of restoring the empire of the Hohenstaufen. Having entered Milan, he placed the Lombard crown upon his head on January 6, 1311, but trouble soon showed itself. His poverty compelled him to exact money from the citizens. The peaceful professions of the Guelphs were insincere, and Robert, King of Naples, watched his progress with suspicion. Risings took place, and after the capture of Brescia, Henry marched to Rome only to find the city in the hands of the Guelphs and the troops of King Robert. The king, unable to obtain possession of St. Peter's, was crowned emperor on June 29, 1312, in the church of St. John Lateran, by some cardinals who declared they acted under compulsion. Failing to subdue Florence, the emperor allied himself with Frederick III, King of Sicily, and, with the Venetians, set out to attack Robert of Naples. On the march he was taken ill, and died at Buon Convento, near Siena, on August 24, 1313. Henry was hailed by Dante as the deliverer of Italy, and in the Paradiso, the poet reserved for him a place marked by a crown. On this day in history, July 27, 1214, the Battle of Bouvines is fought, in which Philip II of France decisively defeats imperial English and Flemish armies, effectively ending John of England's Angevin Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the village. Bouvines, a village on the French-Belgian frontier, population from 1936, 537. Between Lille and Tournai, the scene of one of the greatest battles of the Middle Ages, fought July 27, 1214, between the forces of Philip Augustus, King of France, and those of the coalition formed against him, of which the principal members were the Emperor and King John of England. The plan of the campaign was designed by King John to draw the French king south towards the Loire against himself, while his nephew, the Emperor Otto IV, the princes of the Netherlands, and the main army of the Allies should, at the right moment, march upon Paris from the north. John's part in the general strategy was perfectly executed. The Allies in the north moved tardily, while John, after 2 inroads, turned back to his Guienne possessions on July 3rd. It was not until 3 weeks later that the Emperor concentrated his forces at Valenciennes, and in the interval Philip Augustus had countermarched northward and concentrated an army at Peronne. Philip then took the offensive himself, and in maneuvering to get a good cavalry ground upon which to fight he offered battle, July 27th, on the plain east of Bouvines and the river Marque. The same plain on which in 1794 the brilliant cavalry action of Willems was fought. He had a superiority in cavalry to compensate his decidedly smaller numbers of foot. The imperial army accepted the challenge and drew up facing southwestward towards Bouvines, the heavy cavalry on the wings, the infantry in one great mass in the center, supported by the cavalry corps under the emperor himself. The French army took ground exactly opposite to the enemy, and in a similar formation, cavalry on the wings, infantry, including the milice des communes, in the center, Philip with his own knights in rear of the foot. The battle opened with a confused cavalry fight on the French right, in which individual feats of knightly gallantry were more noticeable than any attempt at combined action. The fighting was more serious between the two centers. The Flemish infantry, who were, at that time, almost the best in existence, drove in the French. Philip led the center body of cavalry to retrieve the day, and after a long and doubtful fight, in which he himself was unhorsed and narrowly escaped death, began to drive back the Flemings. In the meanwhile, the French feudatories on the left wing had thoroughly defeated the Imperialists opposed to them, and William Longsword, Earl of Salisbury, the leader of this corps, was unhorsed and taken prisoner by the warlike Bishop of Beauvais. Victory declared itself also on the other wing, where the French at last routed the Flemish cavalry and captured Count Ferdinand of Flanders, one of the leaders of the coalition. In the center, the battle was between the two mounted reserves led prospectively by the king and the emperor in person. Here, too, the imperial forces suffered defeat, Otto himself being saved only by the devotion of a handful of Saxon knights. The day was already decided in favor of the French when their wings began to close inwards to cut off the retreat of the imperial center. The battle closed with the celebrated stand of Reginald of Bouillon, a revolted vassal of King Philip, who formed a ring of 700 Barbacans pikemen, and not only defied every attack of the French cavalry, but himself made repeated charges or sorties with his small force of knights. Eventually, and long after the imperial army had begun its retreat, the gallant Chiltern was ridden and annihilated by a charge of 3,000 men-at-arms. Reginald was taken prisoner in the melee, and the prisoners also included two other counts, Ferdinand and William Longsword, 25 barons, and over 100 knights. The killed amounted to about 170 knights of the defeated party, and many thousands of foot on either side, of whom no accurate account can be given. The battle is characteristic of normal medieval warfare, the center and two wings fighting their separate battle, without guiding idea or superior guidance. Only Reginald, in basing his mobile action on a stable infantry pivot, showed a glimmer of tactical sense. On this day in history, July 28, 1540, Henry VIII of England marries his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Queen. Catherine Howard died 1542. The fifth Queen of Henry VIII was a daughter of Lord Edmund Howard and a granddaughter of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk. Died 1524. Her father was very poor, and Catherine lived mainly with Agnes, widow of the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, meeting the king at the house of Stephen Garnier, Bishop of Winchester. After the divorce of Anne of Cleves, Henry was privately married to Catherine at Oatlands in July 1540. Soon afterwards, she was publicly acknowledged as queen. Before her marriage, Catherine had had several lovers, among them being a musician, Henry Manock, or Manox, her cousin Thomas Culpeper, and Francis Derham, to whom she had recently been betrothed. After becoming queen, she occasionally met Derham and Culpeper, and in November 1541, Archbishop Cranmer informed Henry that his queen's past life had not been stainless. Cranmer had obtained his knowledge indirectly from an old servant of the Duchess of Norfolk. Derham confessed to his relations with Catherine, and after some denials the queen herself admitted that this was true, but denied betrothal to Derham, or misconduct since her marriage. Derham and Culpeper were executed in December 1541, and their accomplices were punished, but Catherine was released from prison. On fresh evidence of alleged infidelity after marriage, a bill of attainder was passed through Parliament, and on February 13, 1542, the Queen was beheaded. On this day in history, July 29, 1567, the infant James VI is crowned King of Scotland at Stirling. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. James I, born 1566, died 1625,
King of Great Britain and Ireland, and James VI of Scotland, the only child of Mary Queen of Scots and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was born in Edinburgh Castle on June 19, 1566. He was proclaimed King of Scotland on July 24, 1567, upon the forced abdication of his mother, but was kept in the castle of Stirling for safety's sake amid the confused fighting of the early years of his minority until 1578. He was a weakly boy, and although he lived until he was nearly 60, he was never a strong man. James was brought up by the Earl and Countess of Mar. When the Earl died in 1572, his place was well filled by his brother, Sir Alexander Erskine. The king's education was placed under the care of George Buchanan, assisted by Peter Young, and 2 other tutors, who gave the boy a sound training in languages and in theology. The scholastic quality of his education helped to give him a taste for learning, but also tended to make him a pedant. James was only 12 when the Earl of Morton was driven from the regency, and for some time after he can have been no more than a puppet in the hands of intriguers and party leaders. The so-called Raid of Ruthven in 1582 was in fact a kidnapping enterprise carried out in the interest of the Protestant party. It was not indeed till 1583, when he broke away from his captors, that James began to govern in reality. His work can be divided into the part which was a failure and a preparation for future disaster, and the part which was solid achievement, honorable to himself and profitable to his people. His native kingdom of Scotland had the benefit of the second. Between 1583 and 1603 he reduced the anarchical baronage of Scotland to obedience, and replaced the subdivision of sovereignty, which had been the very essence of feudalism, by a strong centralized royal authority. In fact, he did in Scotland the work which had been done by the Tudors in England, by Louis XI in France, and by Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. But James not only brought his disobedient and intriguing barons to order, but also quelled the attempts of the Protestants to found what Hallam has well defined as a Presbyterian Hildebrandism. He enforced the authority of the state over the church, both before his ascension to the throne of England, 1603, and afterwards he took an intelligent interest in the prosperity of his Scottish kingdom, and did much for the pacification of the Hebrides. James's methods of achieving ends in themselves honorable and profitable have made posterity unjust to his real merits. He boasted of his kingcraft, and probably believed that he owed it to his studies. But it was in reality the resource of the weak, the art of playing off one possible enemy against another by trickery. The Marquis de Fontenay, the French ambassador, who saw him in the early part of his reign, speaks of him as cowed by the violence about him, and the terror in which he passed his youth sufficiently explains his preference for guile. He would make promises to everybody, as when he wrote to the Pope in 1584 more than hinting that he would be a good Roman Catholic if helped in his need. His very natural desire to escape from poverty and insecurity of Scotland to the opulent English throne led him to behave basely in regard to the execution of his mother in 1587. Taking good care to do nothing to offend Elizabeth, his crafty methods did him harm in England, where his reign prepared the way for the Great Civil War. In his southern kingdom, his failure was complete. Although England accepted him as the alternative to civil war, and received him with fulsome flattery, he did not win the respect of his English subjects. His undignified personal appearance was against him, and so were his garrulity, his Scottish accent, his slovenliness, and his toleration of disorders in his court, and his favor for handsome male favorites. In ecclesiastical matters, he offered many who contested his severity and rudeness to the Puritan divines at the Hampton Court Conference, 1604, with his politeness to the Roman Catholics. In a country where the authority of the state had been firmly established, and the problem was how to keep it from degenerating into the mere instrument of a king's passions, his insistence on the doctrine of divine right aroused distrust and hostility, though the doctrine had originated in a necessary assertion of the independence of the state in face of the Hildebrandism of Rome and Geneva alike. James's favor for his countrymen helped to defeat his wise wish to bring about a full union between England and Scotland. His profusion kept him assiduous, and drove him to shifts.
Posterity can give him credit for his desire to forward religious peace in Europe, but his Protestant subjects could not see the consistency of a king who married his daughter Elizabeth to the Elector Palatine, a leader of the German Protestants, and also sought to marry his son to an Infanta of Spain. The king's subservience to Spain was indeed almost besotted, and allowed him to be befooled by the ministers of Philip III and Philip IV. The end of his scheming was that he was dragged into a needless war with Spain by his son Charles and his favorite George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, just before his death on March 27, 1625, at his favorite residence, Theobald's. James married in 1589 Anne, second daughter of Frederick II, King of Denmark, by whom he had 3 children who survived infancy: Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died in 1612, Charles, the future king, and Elizabeth, wife of the Elector Palatine Frederick V. Not the least of James's many ambitions was the desire to excel as an author. He left a body of writings which, though of mediocre quality as literature, entitle him to a unique place among English kings since Alfred for width of intellectual interest and literary faculty. His efforts were inspired by his preceptor George Buchanan. His future work was a youthful production in verse, Essays of Apprentice in the Divine Arts of Poesy, Eden Vautrolier, 1584, containing 15 sonnets, and metaphorical invention of a tragedy called Phoenix, a short poem of time, translation from De Bartus, Lucan, and the Book of Psalms, out of Tremellius, and a prose tract entitled An Short Treatise, containing some rulis and cautelus, to be observant and esquit in Scottish poesy. This tract shows acquaintance with the critical reflections of Ronsard and Du Bellay, and of Gascoigne, in his Notes of Instructions 1575. In 1591, James published poetical exercises at vacant hours, including a translation of the Furies of Du Bartas, his own Lepanto, and Du Bartas's version of it, La Lepanthe. His Demonology, a prose treatise denouncing witchcraft and exhorting the civil power to the strongest measures of suppression, appeared in 1599. In the same year, he printed the first edition, 7 copies, of the Basilicon Doron, strongly Protestant in tone. A French edition, specially translated for presentation to the Pope, has a disingenuous preface explaining that certain phrases, e.g., papistical doctrine, are omitted because of the difficulty of rendering them in a foreign tongue. The original edition was, however, translated by order of the suspicious Pope and was immediately placed on the index. In his famous Counterblast to Tobacco, published anonymously, 1604, James forsakes his Scots tongue for Southern English. James's prose works, including his speeches, were collected and edited, folio 1616, by James Montague, Bishop of Winchester, who also translated them into Latin in 1619, also Frankfurt 1689. The True Law of Free Monarchies appeared in 1603, An Apology for the Oath of Allegiance in 1607, and a Déclaration du Roi Jacques pour la droit des rois in 1615. In 1588 and 1589, James issued 2 volumes of meditations on some verses of A. Revelations and B. 1 Chronicles, and 2 other meditations were printed posthumously. On this day in history, July 30th, 762, Baghdad is founded. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Baghdad, the foremost city of Mesopotamia and the capital of modern Iraq, is situated in latitude 33 degrees 20 minutes north and longitude 44 degrees 24 minutes east, on the Tigris at the point where the river and the Euphrates approach their closest approximation to 25 miles. The city was originally built on the west bank of the river, but for over 1,000 years the greater part of the town has been on the east bank. Today there is, however, a large and growing suburb, including a railway station on the west side, the 2 banks being connected by a bridge of boats. Baghdad is described by a traveler who visited it in 1583 as being a town not very great, but very populous, and of great traffic of strangers, for that is the way to Persia, Turkey, and Arabia, and from thence do go caravans for these and other places. Though the town has grown since that description was written, In other aspects, the words are still true, and caravans today, by motor car and aeroplane, still run to Persia, Iran, and Turkey. Baghdad lies at a central point in the Middle East, and there has been from Sumerian times an important town either on this very spot or close at hand. In early Sumerian times, the ancient capital lay at Kish on the Euphrates, and when that river changed its course, Babylon succeeded to Kish. In later times, Ctesiphon, and subsequently Seleucia, on the west bank of the Tigris opposite Ctesiphon, succeeded to the supremacy. Baghdad itself, although on a site which has been occupied since very early times and still preserves the name which it has held for at least 4,000 years, did not rise to the position of a city of the first rank until the foundation of the Arab town on the west bank in the latter half of the 8th century AD. Since that time, the adobe of peace, although it has enjoyed very varying fortunes, has always been the most important city of Mesopotamia. Various factors have contributed to these changes: geographical, political, and, as always, in Mesopotamia, religious. Baghdad forms the meeting point of the land routes of Southwest Asia, until the discovery by the seafaring nations of Western Europe of a sea route to the Far East. Baghdad was the nodal point in the caravan routes between East and West. It commanded the two waterways of the Tigris and Euphrates, and was close to the limit of navigation upwards of the former stream. It was the natural center for the roads through the upland country to the north, for the ways through the Gap of Khorasan, and for the practicable routes across the desert both to the Mediterranean and to the holy cities of Islam. Its commercial position was therefore unrivaled. The more stable condition of the Tigris, which is less given to moving its course than the Euphrates, makes the site, in spite of the constant danger from floods, more favorable to the continued existence of a city than the alternative Kish or Babylon. So long as Mesopotamia remained a fertile land of gardens, whose fruitfulness could excite the wonder of all who visited her, Baghdad was truly the abode of peace and plenty. At the height of her fame, during the early years of the 9th century, Baghdad was the home of wealthy merchants and learned scholars who flourished under the shadow of an enlightened caliphate. Under Mamun, the successor of Harun al-Rashid, it rose to the center of Islam, at a time when Islam represented the highest civilization of the West. Renowned for learning, famous for silks, and for gorgeous tiled buildings, Baghdad became the city of the Arabian Nights, and seemed certain, so favored was its geographical situation, to enjoy a long period of prosperity. But the political circumstances were destined to prevent the realization of this dream. For nearly 2 generations in the middle of the 9th century, the city was deserted in favor of Samarra, and, when the central power did return to Baghdad, the commanders of the faithful had degenerated to the position of mere shadow kings in the hands of the Turkish bodyguard, which predecessors had founded. Mesopotamia, however, still remained the fruitful country which it had been in antiquity, and Baghdad, though shorn of her former splendors, was still an important center which merchants and pilgrims resorted. The real downfall of Baghdad did not come till 1258, when Hulagu the Mongol and his hordes overran Mesopotamia. They destroyed the Arab civilization, and by systematically breaking down the irrigation system, converted what had formerly been an agricultural land into a waste of steppe suited only for pastoral nomadism. A period of political instability ensued. Both these factors contributed to the downfall of Baghdad. She depended for her position on a continuation of a prosperous trade which in an unsettled and devastated country was impossible. Further, a new situation had arisen. From the coming of the Mongols until the 20th century, apart from short intervals, Baghdad was never an independent capital. She was dependent first on the Mongol Emperor of Persia, and then she became the southern capital of a smaller Mongol state. At the beginning of the 15th century, she fell under Turkoman domination, and a century later became part of the Persian kingdom. A prey to the warring factions of the Turks and Persians, the city was more than once put to the sword, but relapsed into comparative obscurity after its final capture by the Sultan Murad IV, an independent Pashalik, attacked by Nadir Shah, and then once more at the beginning of the 19th century restored to full Turkish control. Baghdad remained a remote town, far from the centers of political importance, but often the unfortunate victim of political ambition. But the ancient fame and commercial possibilities of the country led at the end of the 19th century to the idea of a Baghdad railway to connect Central Europe with the Middle East. Finally, in the readjustment of frontiers which followed the war of 1914 to 18, Baghdad was made once more the capital of an independent Arab state. It is significant that this restoration of the city to her old position should be associated with a supreme effort to undo the work of the Mongols and to convert the steppe once more into agricultural land. This changing political position has coincided with far-reaching developments in methods of transport which have restored to Baghdad much of its former importance on the trade routes. Before 1914, Baghdad lay outside these, and the railway was built only as far north as Shurghat, and therefore served no useful purpose. Apart from the uncertainty of river routes, Baghdad remained isolated. Since this time, a line has been built down the Euphrates to Basra. The Tigris line was merely a wartime measure. Of greater importance, however, has been the establishment of a greater aerodrome at Hinadi, a suburb of Baghdad, and the development of aircraft services to Cairo and Basra. Further than this, the old desert roads are now usable at regular intervals by motor cars, so that the journey from London to Baghdad can now be made in a week. Baghdad has direct air connections with London and with India and the Far East. The completion of the railroad to Turkey resulted in a direct rail connection with the Mediterranean. Owing, no doubt, to the improvement in communications, Baghdad in the 20th century began once more to regain her rightful place as the great market of the Middle East. The principal exports are carpets, wool, gum, hides, and dates. A considerable import trade is carried on, especially in cotton and tea, most of which is re-exported. The Persian trade, once more, became of value, and Mosul looked to Baghdad as the natural channel through which to sell her grain. The traveler who wishes to see a purely Eastern city will not find it in Baghdad, except in the byways and in the few old mosques which remain. Hilla has preserved better its purity Oriental character and recalls many of the features which characterized Baghdad before it was westernized. During the 20th century, changes have taken place in the city itself, which have altered it out of all recognition. Some of the main roads have been straightened and a macadam surface laid down, so that a great part of the city is available for motor traffic. There are a telephone and taxicab service. A modern water system replaces the old canals and insanitary methods of drawing water from the Tigris and its subsidiary channels, and there has consequently been considerable improvement of public health. Though in spite of registration, statistics are not yet reliable. Population from 1935, 287,000. Estimated from 1938, 400,000. Inside the town itself, although the old converted bazaars still survive, there are numerous stores on western lines, a hospital, and modern hotels. Near the racecourse, what is practically a garden suburb, is rapidly developing, and there is another large settlement growing up round the aerodrome at Hinadi. Not the least interesting feature of the new regime is the establishment of a museum of Mesopotamian antiquities, largely through the energy and enthusiasm of Miss Gertrude Bell. It receives a share of all the antiquities excavated in Iraq. On this day in history, July 31st, 1009, Pope Sergius IV becomes the 142nd Pope, succeeding Pope John XVIII. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Sergius. Sergius IV, Pope from 1009 to 1012, originally bore the name of Bucaporca, os Porci. He was a mere tool in the hands of the nobility of the city. He was succeeded by Benedict VIII.